Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us again today for our Grow Blue Culture webinar, Blue Dialogos, Engaging the Growing Blue Culture Audience. So today, this is about you. We're doing something a little different than we've done in our past sessions. If you've joined us previously, you know that we've hosted various guest speakers, but today is about your thoughts and your questions. And in the chat bar is where we're going to invite you to broadcast your thoughts and questions. We ask that you send it to panelists and everyone. This gives you the opportunity to ask everything and for us all to be able to see it. I can't encourage you enough that today this is about you and this is your chance. So please use this opportunity. We've allotted extra time today to get to as many of your questions as we can. And those that we don't get to, we'll send answers from our panelists in our follow-up email. So today we welcome our panelists. First off, in his 50th year in policing, he's a police commander emeritus from Aurora, Illinois, and founder of Blue Courage. Welcome, Michael Nila. And applied cultural anthropologist and senior engagement leader, consultant, and manager partner with Thomas Leland. Welcome, Dr. Ken Price. A cultural anthropologist who specializes in diversity and inclusion, mindful leadership, organizational change, and strategic planning. We welcome Dr. Robert Adams, Jr. A 20-year veteran of the San Francisco Police Department, currently serving as the commanding officer assigned to San Francisco Police Academy and master educator with Blue Courage. You know him as our webinar host with the most, Captain Jack Hart.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And now we'll turn it over to Ken and Michael to get us started with why we're doing this webinar series and what brought this series about in the first place.
Hey, Becky. So Michael, this is a chance, I think, for us to share a little bit about how we got into this. And you know, first of all, it's been an incredible journey already since we first met almost a decade ago. And we've been able to sort of see our paths come together and then come apart and come together again every couple of years or so is what it feels like. And it happened again recently because the last time we really worked together was at the tail end of the last administration, where they had asked to take on a task force for 21st century policing, which came out with recommendations. And one of the big areas of concern in the recommendations was around trust and legitimacy. And within that trust and legitimacy focal area within policing, Michael invited me to come and consider the role of culture in trust and legitimacy in policing. And we were able to begin a process there that involved a number of people that were able to get trained on a sort of train-the-trainer basis within policing to understand and comprehend what are some opportunities for how we can improve the culture of policing. But that's such a huge topic. And so what I you know, come back to now, we began a process then, that was about 4 years ago nearly. Obviously, when things happened at the end of May, beginning of June, and it became clear that there's a huge movement occurring in our society here, not only in the U.S., which was amazing to see, in fact, that this movement is become a very global movement around justice. And it really clearly came back in many ways to this question about trust and legitimacy, in my opinion. Immediately thought of Michael, and I thought of the work that we had done. I live in Atlanta, and I was very near where some of the protests / riots had occurred, and you could smell some of the burning, you could feel some of the tear gas in the air. And I guess I felt extremely urgent, and so we began the conversation the following day. Michael, what is your story coming up to the moment when we actually had the conversation?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ken. And so grateful for your being our mentor at Blue Courage in this area of culture. And our interest in culture started when we were building the Blue Courage curriculum, because we knew that, you know, if we were going to create a healthy, professional organization, if we were going to transform our police agencies, and I didn't mean that in a negative sense that we were doing things wrong, but simply how do we get our police organizations on the path to continuous growth and improvement, and improving how we deliver our services and how we improve ourselves too at the same time. We knew culture was at the heart of that. I mean, you could go all the way back to Neil Troutman, who some people probably remember, who started the Center for Law Enforcement Ethics. And one of the key things he talked about was culture, and making mention of the fact that the things that bring cops down more than anything else are greed, anger, lust, and peer pressure. And peer pressure is what he would refer to as culture. So when we were building Blue Courage, we knew that we could not build this type of transformational personal and organizational growth process without addressing culture, so that police officers could understand the powerful influence that our culture has on us. That culture influences us, it changes us, it transforms us. And so I believe that we had to understand that. And I think most of us who are practitioners in this field believe, well, oh, we understand culture, we've been a part of it since the day we came on the job. But through my conversations with you and Jörg Schmitz and Robert, and even the Simon Sineks of the world, and General George Flynn from the Marine Corps, who taught us culture as well, what I began to realize is we don't know much about culture. And so you helped us refine that, and really brought the science and the art of anthropology to the understanding of culture. And so we have continued to dig deeper into this as we've been teaching Blue Courage across the country. But when you called me on that Saturday night and we discussed the next day on Sunday, I was so excited, because at the heart of everything that is being discussed right now is cultural transformation. We hear it from everybody, from city managers and mayors and police executives. We got to transform the culture, transform the culture, transform the culture. And sadly enough, I suspect most of those people don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what that entails. They don't know what the dynamics are. Probably don't even know beyond a rudimentary sense what culture is. So one of the things we felt that we could do is we should seize the opportunity, seize this moment, to both amplify our own understanding of at least police culture. You understand culture and Robert understands culture, but how do we understand police culture and those dynamics that have led up to this moment? You know, this moment, we've been here before, but what are the dynamics that led up to this moment? And where do we go from here in a healthy way, not a knee-jerk reaction way, but in a healthy, thoughtful, reflective way, that we can literally improve policing and even the global society in the process, because the police don't operate in a vacuum, and we're products of a greater society. So I'm incredibly grateful for you and Robert and Jörg and those who are teaching us, and those who have come on these webinars already, because they paved a pathway for us to more deeply explore where we need to go.
Yeah, that was really what I think kind of fired me as well in that initial moment when we first spoke, was that it was all over the news. I mean, the question was flashing everywhere. You know, need to change the culture of policing. And my first thought was, that's not exactly all we got to do. That's not, I mean, that's already huge, but that's not even really the whole question. I mean, the question is, what do we need to do about society, you know, which really represents policing? What do we need to do in order to somehow bring communities and policing together in a much more effective way? And so to me, that is where we launched this question. We were able to bring Robert into the conversation immediately, and Jack immediately into the conversation, and then it's expanded to our participants. So I'm very excited that today we're really focused on participants' interaction, your questions, your thoughts. And so it's not just questions. I want to very mindfully invite you to share your opinions, share your views, as well as your questions. And that's our purpose today. We expanded this time a little bit in order to not run out of time. So if we need it, we've got a full hour, and we're looking forward to that interaction with all of you to see what are your thoughts about this question about policing, culture, and society in the U.S. particularly today.
Well, Ken, thank you so much. I really appreciate that summary that you had, Michael, except I felt like you were directing that at me because even as a over 20-year professional in a major metropolitan police department like San Francisco, who has the formal rank of captain, I'm still struggling with culture and how to shift it and influence it amongst the pressures, not just from outside of the organization, but definitely from within it. And so even though I've hosted the last 4 webinars, I'm still struggling. And I hope to bring in Robert to kind of ask a question that I had, and then also to bring in one of the questions that was emailed to growblueculture.com. So when you were talking, Michael, I was thinking back when I had been teaching the culture module in Blue Courage for quite a while, and I was feeling good, because in that we define culture, we distinguish between formal and informal culture, healthy and unhealthy aspects of culture, and then we work with students to recognize that they're responsible for the culture, that you got to have empathy for how the culture, for why it exists, but then you got to have that change strategy to figure out how we can shift it to reinforce and reward those things and align those things that make an organization great with principles. Terrific. Then I opened up a Harvard Business Review magazine, and they came out with an article, and the title was "Culture is Not the Culprit." And I almost fell onto the floor. They argued, forget culture, fix the systems and the culture will shift. So Robert, from your perspective, is it culture? Is it the systems within the culture? Is it both? Or are we really just using the same word?
So I think that it's both. They're overlapping because systems and cultures are really heuristics. What I mean by that is they're just sort of ways to sort of get hold of something that's really dynamic and that is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily, we have individual agency inside of cultures, but at the same time, how do things reproduce themselves again and again in different places and time? And that's sort of like, it's systems and cultures in conjunction with one another. And so we always have to be, I don't know if there's an answer per se of which one is the problem, as much as these are tools to help us be more aware and more mindful about our behaviors, expectations, and the assumptions that we operate on.
Okay, so in your definition of culture, we talked about those things that are rewarded, that are expected, reinforced, and rewarded. So I want to talk just about rewards for a second, because we have several questions coming in the comments and also emailed to us that revolve around this topic. And so one question came in from Officer Catherine Winters from my agency, San Francisco, who's a graduate of the Blue Courage and has been following these webinars. And she had a question that brings up this collision of narratives that you had mentioned related to awards and recognitions. And here's what she said. She said, we've long awarded great acts of bravery, often reserved for situations involving the deadly use of force, but we often overlook rewarding the behaviors, actions, and acts that reflect the true heart of our profession. And her question is, how do we reward in a meaningful way those moments that reflect not only our ideals, but how the men and women of our profession bring those ideals to life? And so when I first read this question, for me, I was like, God, this is the exact systems question that I wanted to ask you, Robert, because the question is really, are cops extrinsically motivated by a reward? So I remember someone gave me a compliment once and I said, it's nothing. And the person said, I don't know what it is about you cops, but you guys have a brutal humility about you. And that really struck me. And so there is this clash, I think, between whether cops want to be rewarded at all, which extrinsically, which I think actually deep down we do, even though we say we don't want to. But then if you asked, what's the greatest recognition that you've received in our organization? I would tell you that in our department, and consistently, I've heard this through the last 20 years of my career and beyond it, that the greatest recognition a cop has received in this organization over the last 30 years was a 29-cent pen that one of our legends in the organization, Captain Greg Corrales, would send out after you made a good arrest. And the pen would say, stamped on the side of it, crime fighter extraordinaire. And that has consistently been more meaningful than like a formal ribbon on a Nike jacket. So I guess the challenge here is, and as you said, the blueprint for change is to bridge the gap between the formal and the informal. So the question is, should we formally fix this system and close the gap between these formal rewards and recognition when the current culture values the informal recognition so much more?
Right. I think it is going to be a mix, because in a lot of ways we heard from Art Acevedo where he was talking about how long he sits at his desk personally signing each commendation, and how he really, when he goes out there, he gives people verbal affirmations. And because I think in the end, and Chief Moyer also said that in Arizona, I think in the end, what we're really looking for is people want to be seen. They want to be recognized for the things that they do. And I think that you want to mix that sort of awareness of how are you affirming your people in difficult circumstances? Because policing is difficult. And policing has a lot of places for easy critique and for missteps, because you're serving the public and you're very visible to the public. But it's like you said, those little symbolic things of a pen, a 29-cent pen, crime fighter extraordinaire. There are tremendous ways in which you can utilize informal structures to say, I see you, I value you, and I have your back. And I think in any leadership culture, that's where leaders should be looking to kind of figure out how to mobilize that and how to have their own personal expression of affirmation and reward for good behaviors. And that's part of how you set the expectations and reward good behavior. And that's how you're going to sort of lead. Because what we had with the 3 leaders that we've had on so far, it's clear that they sweat the details. So they're all great at seeing the overall systems and departments, but it's clear that they are also in the micro levels. They're in the weeds leading, and that's important.
And so Brandy, just in the comments, asked, as a follow-up, whose recognition actually matters? And I guess that's more of a subjective question than an objective one, right? I guess it's what's the one that resonates most with an individual that would then enable peak performance and resilience to come back and keep putting on the uniform every single day. That's a great question. Thanks, Brandy. Tough one.
Yeah, I think this is where, like I said, it's not because necessarily leaders in a hierarchy, they matter more. It's not that. I think it's that because there's a way in which rank and file go out every day. They're on the streets and they're taking tremendous chances and risks with their lives, and they're giving their best to try to perform well. And so that whole idea about oftentimes it seems like the folks that are in the offices don't care, don't know, don't understand anymore. And so these informal recognitions bridge that gap between folks that sit in their offices and make decisions versus people that are on the streets and have to make decisions, to say that we're one team and I understand and see and value what you do and what you bring to the equation. Because that also, it also accelerates and inspires leadership at all levels. So that folks, because when folks start to go unseen, that's like going dark. And when people go dark, that's the time when a lot of stuff that shouldn't be happening ends up happening, right?
Absolutely. Malini just sent in a question, and I think this is a good one, because it talks about not just the training session that we had with Chief Moyer, but also what you just said about what are you embodying? What do we want our officers' way of being to be? And Malini says, there's mounting evidence that bias is often so deep that training does not always translate into change behaviors. How are we making sure that the leaders in the police force demonstrate what you want, these behaviors and values that you want emulated? And says, my faith in the police force is really shaken because I guess of everything that's going on, and this inability perhaps to embody what we say that we are. That we at our toughest times we can be the embodiment of virtue and right. Does anyone on the panel want to take a stab at that one?
I'll take a stab at it, Jack. This is Michael, and I think you cite one of the real challenges in shaping a healthy culture, in that often our leader behaviors do not match what leaders say. And what we teach in leadership schools or management schools are often not reflected in the day-to-day behaviors too often in those who lead our organizations. So number one, we're not modeling right behavior. to the organization, and that becomes a problem in and of itself. But I also think, and we're going to talk about education a little bit later on, moving from training to education, but I think that's why we have to have a blended approach in our organizations, that we're not just training, that we're creating experience for our people so they can have a deeper level of understanding, which will lead to greater discernment and hopefully greater wisdom in the organization. We really need to, we're transforming hearts and minds through education. And training, we're just teaching somebody to do something, and the more times you do it, the better you are at it. But how do we train or educate our police officers to think and reflect and discern? That's what leads to the difference of behaviors. And we don't do that because it's hard. We do know how to do it, but it's hard.
Yeah, Michael, I hear you. I think that's probably been the most difficult part for me, being in the profession at this time, is really trying to wrestle with that, is to really sit back and think, what have I done over the past 21 years? And has it been right? And have we been right? And has our way of being been right? And how will history judge our actions? Wendy in the comments in one of the questions says, what can be done to shift older generations who may have known bias and violence for decades and now see what they've known for years is now on video? And I think that's part of that. It's that, I think that's the brilliance of Blue Courage, Michael, and your ability to come up with that, a 99-cent mirror that's given out to all of the participants in Blue Courage really is the most transformative thing, because and we've seen that so much with even in Don Quixote, the man from La Mancha. Everyone had to surround him with mirrors so that he could look in the mirror and take this critical view of who he was to the world. And I find that to be such a powerful thing and a powerful question that's really, I think, shaken our profession to the core. And we know that some people have responded by retiring and getting out of the profession as fast as possible, and not really willing to necessarily sit and struggle with our past and present and perhaps our future.
Maybe this is a moment to, I know we have a question from Mark Langford, who has asked a question about police and trust and how we can turn this crisis moment into an opportunity. And I think that right now we are faced with systems that have failed us. They failed to save us from the effects of pandemic, economic meltdown, and even in some cases, police misconduct. And if we just listen to the language of this moment, people are talking about systemic racism, and not critiques of an individual person or act, but of larger system failures. So that George Floyd in some ways comes to symbolize more than himself. He becomes a symbol of unjustified police violence, over-policing, and biased law enforcement systems. In some ways, he's like a new Emmett Till, if you will. And so that in some ways, American policing becomes an avatar for a larger failure of systems overall. And we have to think our ways through these things. Because, so for example, think about how many structures and people had to work together, some would say conspire together, to keep Ahmaud Arbery's killers beyond the reach of the law. So, and then at another point, we have to say, it's not even about individual behaviors and attitudes of some cops, of individual cops, but it's the systems and the departments that are not collecting data, analyzing data to make sure that they're treating all communities uniformly. So when you get a situation where 83% of your stop and frisk interactions are with African Americans only, then you have it's a data point that shows you we have a problem here. So it's in this general suspicion of systems that we find ourselves. And as anthropologists, what our role can be is to help our partners think beyond their feelings and reactions, to not to say whether to get beyond the idea, is this fair or unfair to critique, but to understand what's at stake. So how can the torn fabric of trust be repaired if we're only speaking to ourselves in our own nomenclature and on our own terms? So once we gain alterity, which is thinking outside of ourselves or beyond ourselves, we can start to build cross-cultural dialogues and actions that can restore trust and legitimacy. This is the value in understanding the clash of narratives or collision of narratives. It's to be able to solve them, right? So some of the critiques of policing originate in stereotypes or misinformation. But the challenge is to focus less on the myth or false ideas and explore why outsiders would accept these ideas as true. You know, Paul Rabineau, who's a anthropologist at UC Berkeley, argues that a problem is a symptom. It is a sign of a breakdown, and it is an invitation to create a solution. And I like that idea. So that if we take today's crisis and think about it less as a indictment of policing and more about as an opportunity to show up courageously to solve the problem that's behind the symptoms that we see.
Drop the mic, it's over.
Yeah.
Webinar's over, that's it. But I love that, Robert. It's such a mix of so many things. And it's like data is one thing, but that can be two-dimensional and polarizing just as much as all of different community engagement and strategies and so on. And I think I love the idea of shifting the goalpost from exiting the pain or getting us out of pain to actually where we want to be, which is healing and communicating and being in community with others. That's so difficult when we are challenged in such a hard way, especially because being a cop is who we are 24 hours a day. We're not just professional cops where we can do it for 8, 10, or 12 hours a day. This really is our way of being. And in order to get us out of our comfort zone in this difficult time, we've got to find that goal, beginning with the end in mind, as you would say, Robert. So I really, I really love that. And so Michael, maybe even you want to take a shot at talking about leadership. We have several questions here talking about where does this begin? Does it start within our organizations? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Do you want to maybe summarize the key learnings from our leadership discussion with Chief Acevedo, and maybe that will help provoke and prompt additional comments and questions?
Yes, thank you for all the questions and comments that you've already put in the chat box, and keep them coming. They will, this is what it's about, adding your voices to this exploration of culture. And we thought one of the ways we can add value to this is we synthesized down some of the key learnings from the people that have spoken to us already. They can become a blueprint for us. Somebody in the chat asked a question about what can we do like right now? So many things are like future focused, but what can we do right now, this moment? And I think almost every one of these things are things that are doable right now with a little bit of attention and intention. So number one, presence. Chief Acevedo talked so eloquently about the fact that he spends a tremendous amount of time with his troops out in the field. And I follow him on Twitter, and I see he's out there at 1 in the morning, 3 in the morning making arrests. He's there on New Year's Eve and Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I'm like, when does he manage the police department? Well, the police department kind of manages itself. His job is to lead. And so he very eloquently said, you can't lead and influence people from behind a computer screen or behind your desk or in your office. You got to get out. So I think a very first lesson is FaceTime matters. FaceTime influences our people. FaceTime creates an opportunity to create trust and dialogue. So presence, leadership presence matters immensely. Chief Acevedo also talked about the fact that your people have to feel you. It's not you talking to them. It's not putting out policy. It's not putting out press conferences. They need to feel you. In fact, one of the things he said is, people don't agree with everything that I say in this organization, and I have haters in the organization, but nobody will question my heart. Nobody questions my intention and my passion for and love for this profession and for them, because they can feel that. Robert, I'm going to tee you up on this one in a moment, because you so eloquently talked to us yesterday about courageous leadership when we were discussing and preparing for this this session. But there is no more important thing that I believe we need in this moment right now than courageous leadership. The leadership has to be bold. It can't shrink in the shadows. It can't be silent. Our voices have to be heard right now, and people have to know that there is a leader, and we're leading with confidence, and we're leading with boldness right now. And I think there's a tremendous leadership void right now, both in our profession and literally in many of our institutions, and even at the highest levels of our government. He talked about emotional capital. We have to build relationships. Leadership is a relationship. What are you doing to invest in developing relationships in every interaction you have? And we know every interaction we have with our people or the community is an opportunity to either enhance trust in the relationship or degrade it. No action is neutral. So if we're constantly focused on that this is an opportunity to build a relationship and build some emotional capital, and we need to start building that way before the crisis hits, so we have something to call on. Setting the bar high. Art said we often set the bar high in our profession. We talked about we're the best police department, on the planet. We set the bar high, but then we don't enforce the standards. So, accountability becomes really important. Courageous leadership is willing to hold people accountable. And he said, and as you're holding them accountable, we have to build them up. We have to love them. In Blue Courage, we always say you can't lead people who you do not love. So while we're holding people accountable, we're holding their feet to the fire, we're giving them continuous feedback so that they can be better. We do it in a way that conveys, I care about you and I have your back. And at the same time, we're building them up. He mentioned the ratio has to be 10-1. If you're going to criticize the ratio, you better be given 10 compliments to offset that one negative experience. And of course, integrity is the whole ball game, particularly for us in this profession. And in Houston Police Department, he said, everybody knows, you lie, you die. Any mistake can be forgiven, it can be dealt with, but if you lie, you die. It just can't, because our integrity is everything for us. And I love the fact that the great leaders that we talk to also are pushing back on a negative narrative about policing. They're telling the good story. We're our own worst enemies because we don't tell our own story. That's that kind of, an unhealthy sense of humility that we might have. Push back, tell the great things that police officers are doing all the time. The other day I was watching a video of, I think it was the West New Haven Police Department or maybe the New Haven Police Department, and a guy was in the ocean and drowning, and a cop jumps in the water and swims. It looked like a long way and saves this guy's life. And I'm seeing that video at the same time I'm hearing the police are, defund the police, forget the police, they don't do anything good and can't trust the police. And I thought, wow, that collision of narratives. And then, of course, this moment, Art very emphatically said, history is watching us right now. Tom Peters, the great leadership expert who wrote In Search of Excellence and many, many other great books on leadership, says what we do now, how we show up right now and for these next 90 days during these crises is going to be how we're remembered. It's going to be our legacy. So there's a great awakening around us, and now we need courageous leadership. So Robert, I want to throw it to you once again. Can you talk about that need for courageous leadership today and what it looks like?
And
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think that in this moment of pain and trauma that the whole society is going through, leaders, both formal leaders and informal leaders, have to be CEOs of hope. They have to inspire us to pick ourselves up and move beyond the circumstances we find ourselves in. And you like to talk a lot about Winston Churchill, Michael, and I agree. It's that sort of like rousing sense of hope so that we can see beyond and see around the corner of our crisis circumstance. But also, I think that part of being a courageous leader is going against the human nature, how we're trained. Because a lot of times when crisis comes, we recoil, we turn inside, and we try to avoid the heat of the crucible. And one of the lessons I learned was from a documentary I saw about the Secret Service. And it talked about how Secret Service agents that guard the president are taught to defeat or turn off their natural recoiling when they hear a gunshot. Normally the human body gets small. They were taught to get big because they want to become the target. They want to deflect the bullets. And so that was a insight for me that when you face crisis, that our natural inclination is to retreat, but instead, courageous leadership is about getting big as possible. And one of the things that we've seen from these three leaders is these are folks that are huge. I mean, their presence, their sense of hope is big. And when we sat down in these three webinars with these leaders, their sense of optimism drowned out any sense of hopelessness, any sense of we need to just hang everything up. It's, like I felt like we were moving forward to, like, I felt like I wanted to go down to Houston or to Tempe or out to California and follow these leaders and help be part of that change. And that's why, like, so for example, after Chief Moyer spoke, I said that she delivered a poem of hope because I was sort of just enthusiastic and feeling hopeful about what the next moment brings. To get back to Mark's question, there is tremendous opportunity in this crisis, tremendous opportunity for police officers and police departments to lead and to shape what's going on. As Chief Moyer said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so this is a chance to be at the table and to define what courageous leadership looks like and what healthy culture defined from the inside can be, to define the possible.
I love that. And I remember, Art, and as we have said throughout the police profession for many, many years, you need to have your resignation letter in the drawer, and if you're asked to be compromised, or you're unwilling to be that courageous leader, or the moment gets bigger than you and you're shrinking in the shadows, put that letter out there. So I thank you for that. I absolutely love what you said, and we need to add those to these key leadership lessons. There was
Michael,
also,
yeah,
go
I think
ahead,
Michael, you and Robert probably just answered this question for Anita Fox, who sent a great question in, and speaking about share your views on blue flu and how it should be addressed in blue culture. And I think in your nobility book, Michael, you talk about President Coolidge, who said that no one is compelled to choose the profession of police officer, but having chosen it, you are required to live up to its highest standards and ideals. And that policing is the front row to life. And how could you miss this opportunity, as Robert said, to be not on the menu, but to be on the front end of this change? And I think perhaps addressing both of your comments and the words on the screen of integrity, emotional capacity, setting a high bar, feeling this moment, and that history is watching us, might get us to break from our conditioning of calling in sick, so that others can feel the pain that we feel, but maybe there's a higher calling and purpose.
And I think you're right, Jack, that we as police officers, we have knee-jerk reactions too. And our knee-jerk reactions are, when something happens that we don't like, is, we'll vote a no confidence with the chief, blue flu. These things have been going on forever and ever and ever. But they're not, they're reflexive responses to what we're experiencing, but they're not thoughtful. They're not mindful. They're not creating good results. In fact, they're creating more harm, because when you call in sick with the blue flu, are you forgetting that some of your cops are showing up and now they're short of support and backup because you're protesting in this way? Find another way. Find another creative way that's artful and that has grace, but that doesn't turn the people who want to be on our side against us, because I think that's what it actually does. But one of the things that's not in this key leadership lessons that should be is, we've got to always instill a deep sense of purpose and meaning. We do it through the nobility of policing. And I believe when you are filled with that, when your heart, your soul is filled with that deep sense of purpose and the reminding of the oath we took, we won't have those knee-jerk reactions like the blue flu. It's too easy. Pick a hard one and engage in the fight with the hard one, but one that reflects the very best of who we are and that upholds that nobility standard of the mission that we took an oath to sustain.
And that storytelling is such an important part of that.
Absolutely.
And I love that Malini talks about, I like the notion of history as watching us, the same notion of history of the past helps us to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Love
Mhm.
that Alvin Toffler quote there. It
Yeah.
says, the question is, does police onboarding include poignant, real stories of the past? And I feel like so much of the stories we tell are when officers have been killed, or if there's been, lapses of officer safety, and that our history is best told in the names that are etched on the marble wall. But I also remember, Michael, us recently going to Chicago and hearing the story of Superintendent Johnson, who, at the deaths of Officer Gray and when the two officers were killed on the elevated train line in Chicago, that he personally manifested tremendous courage to do what needed to be done to take the pain of that moment so that his officers wouldn't have to. And when I heard that story, I was blown away that it had not reached the national narrative. But I was even more blown away when someone walked up to me and said, hey, just so you know, he wasn't the first superintendent to do that. And I said, what? And that Superintendent Hillard had done the same thing decades earlier, involving a similar circumstance. And I thought, wow, that's the connection to storytelling and courageous leadership. Because Superintendent Johnson was probably a newer officer watching what that superintendent had done at the time, and that gave him courage and permission to then be courageous. That one person who steps forward can give everyone permission to step forward as well. And so I love that question, because our storytelling needs to be not about patting ourselves in the back and getting glory, but so that we can create this infection of courage throughout an organization.
Yeah, and let me finish this leadership lessons with, Nate asked a great question about when he watched the Minneapolis officer kneeling on his neck and ignoring even the calls from rookie officers to, hey, shouldn't we be doing something else? That he didn't necessarily see a racist cop, because of course we can't see into his soul, but what he saw was an arrogant cop. And his question is about, so often in our profession, we're arrogant. And he says, how do we as a profession curb the arrogance that comes with the propensity of alpha personalities in law enforcement, the I'm in charge, I know better kind of mindset? I think all of these things, Robert's answers and these key learnings on leadership, this embracing of humility, which we're going to talk about in a moment, I think all of these things begin to wither away at the sense of cockiness and arrogance and I know it all that, our profession tends to have, rather than the sense of grace and humility that the profession actually requires. And so I think we're going to answer that question a little more deeply as we go.
Yeah, I love that, Michael. I think that this slide might actually just summarize that. This was some notes and some thoughts that we had taken from that discussion with Chief and Under Sheriff and Presidential Appointee Barney Malekian, and really getting deep into these bold and underlined terms of being values-based instead of rules-based. I immediately went and Googled Wheaton, Illinois to figure out how do we emulate that in our organization. Wow, we are judged by our principles of leadership and 146 training bulletins that can be amended. But these values are everlasting and timeless. And we don't try and fit situations into principles. The principles exist. And I love that of being able to hold our people up, that, if we treat people as they are, we make them worse. But if we treat them as they should be in the highest ideals, they perhaps could get them a little good for you. Practical wisdom, loving that practical wisdom is about doing the right thing at the right time, that we must have the moral will to figure out what is the actual right thing to do in this moment. Right now, present moment awareness, in spite of what might happen in the future, what might happen in the past, get all that conditioning out of the way. And when we have that moment, what is this moment asking of us for the morally right thing to do? And then having the moral skill to get it done. Curiosity. I love that, that we're the most visible representation of government. I was really struck by that people didn't hate the police. One Eldridge Cleaver was saying that, it wasn't that the police we hated, it was the government, but you as the most visible one were the ones that we could get recourse from. And I thought that was a very deeply stirring in my soul to remind me that it's perhaps not personal. Maybe it's not the color of my skin, but maybe it's just the color of my uniform and what this uniform is represented, and gives us a greater sense of not taking it personally, but deep conviction to heal some pain and to warm some hearts. And that idea of self-awareness, Chief Moyer was so good at that by talking about that present moment awareness and really being in the moment with others. And what is this moment asking of us? Really great. Trinae said, when you create this climate of enthusiasm through courageous leadership, people want to follow, work together, and support. This is truly about relationships, courage, transparency, and a forward mindset. It's all about leadership. Yes, I love that. But leadership, while it might start at the top, leadership's most important roles are in that frontline supervisor, that sergeant, or perhaps the field training officer. Michael, do you want to talk about that just in terms of who are the influencers in an organization? Because really we could have all the chiefs of police in the world come on to a webinar like this, but you know, back on the ranch, the biggest influencers may not be policy. It may not, and it may be these cultural safeguard, these cultural warriors that have 3 or 2 stripes on their sleeve.
Yeah, exactly. You know, when we created Blue Courage, everybody said, who's this targeted for? Is it the executives? Is it the recruits in the academy? Who is it? And I say it's for everybody. But most importantly, it's for the influencers. That we designed Blue Courage to influence the influencers. Who are those? Well, who influences what a police officer does at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody's watching? It's their sergeants, it's their lieutenants, it's their field training officers, it's their instructors in an academy. Of course, it's the brass, but the higher you get up in the organization, the less of an influence they are, you know, in directly what these police officers do. So if we want to target transformation, we got to transform the influencers. First and foremost, we got to transform those people who are both formal leaders and informal leaders. And when we talk about leadership influence here through this webinar, we're not talking about people with stars and bars only. We're talking about everybody in the organization, because every police officer is a leader. So we have to reframe how we develop our leaders and stop thinking, well, you start getting developed when you put stripes on your sleeve. It's too late. We've got to start developing our leadership capacity, our humility, our intellectual curiosity, all these things you talked about. We have to start developing those things day one in the police academy and never stop until our people retire. And by the way, I think we should continue developing our people after they retire, because our retired officers often are suffering deeply and you know, committing suicide and deeply depressed and drinking themselves to death. So we can't forget them too. They paid a price to be here. It's like forgetting our veterans. If we forget our retired people.
Thank you, Michael. Well, up on the screen, we have some notes from Chief Moyer on from training to education. And that second bullet point really struck me. And you probably noticed during the webinar when I was really struck by this distinction between culture and climate. And I think this follows Richard, who's Gavilanes, who's on the webinar today. Thank you for joining us, Richard. Richard typed in, what immediate changes do you suggest that can be implemented immediately? And what other do you strive for that may take longer via policy or systematic changes? And thank you for this forum. And Ken, maybe I can ask that to you. What, you know, changing culture might take a decade, as someone had previously said, but maybe we can change the area that we can influence by being sensitive to the climate. Would you mind talking a little bit about that, and what other immediate changes you think are within our grasp that you've seen work, maybe outside of police?
Great question, Richard. Thank you for that question. And I think it does very much link to Chief Moore's notion of climate. And so when we talk about deep culture, it has to do with the values. Values are usually not even questioned by the people who hold them. Beliefs, sometimes questioned, behaviors more commonly questioned, but even they usually don't get questioned. So what we do, in other words, in deep culture just doesn't get questioned. So what we have to look at in climate differently is what is in the realm of what I can actually see and is in a sense more tangible right now. And so I think what I find that is helpful is for us to think about, you know, the first action that we can take to shift those values and beliefs and behaviors at a deeper level is to just make a decision that we're going to provide feedback to one another that is meaningful, that is substantive, that is coming from a place of trust. So in other words, we need to provide good feedback. And feedback is, if you create at your sort of first instance a more feedback-driven culture, then you have a lot of areas where you can start to make changes. You can decide, what are we going to really highlight in that feedback above all? What are we going to pay attention to? Because as leaders, what we decide to pay attention to has a lot of influence over other people's choices. So if we provide feedback on something, that tells somebody that really mattered enough to get feedback. Either it could be, good, very, excellent job. By the way, good feedback has got to be specific. It can't just end with good job. It has to also say something a little more specific, like it was good because this is what you did, and that is really what we're trying to exhibit. And so it should be specific. And if it's a room for improvement feedback, by the way, it's the same thing. If it's something that you feel you need to improve, I would like to know exactly what I can do differently next time. And that is a huge area, I think, for leaders, but ultimately everybody, as Michael was just saying, to provide feedback. So you establish what, in other words, is a feedback climate and culture by making the decision that we're going to highlight those areas that matter the most to us, and we're going to reinforce, and we're actually going to reward with good feedback those values, beliefs, and behaviors that are where we want to go. That's a pretty immediate choice. And so everybody gets to do that every day. Frequently, what we do is we avoid feedback. We avoid receiving it, and we avoid giving it. So to me, that's one of the areas that I've seen in trying to shift cultures that you can tackle most immediately. When you have to do one of the several questions came in around what do older people in the profession do to make the shift? And I think it's going to be harder for somebody who has been, sort of trained into a way of viewing the world that is pretty deeply ingrained, although everybody has that to some extent. The openness to really question that changes with time, for sure, as you get the reinforcement as to what is the perhaps right way to do it in our experience. But if we decide, according to what even Barney Malecki was suggesting, that we can really shift to a values-based approach to interactions, that has to get reinforced again through feedback. If we don't tie it directly to what I see somebody doing, it's not going to go very deep. And I think what, for me at least, is going to be critical is to see that we're able to tie those choices to what's happening with the community. And that's where a lot of the breakdown seems to occur right now, is that there's a lack of connectivity between the values of the police and the values of the community. And until that is begun to be understood more fully, and there actually needs to be trust and legitimacy, I think, to both sides, then you could perhaps see some changes at a deeper level.
Well, Ken, one of the big,
I would love to see people just giving good feedback first.
yeah, well, one of the barriers, I think, to that from our culture, Ken, is the attorneys. Okay, Shakespeare was right, kill the lawyers first. I can say that, I'm an attorney. But it's like, I bring it back to the practical wisdom. So Ken Sharp and Barry Schwartz were talking about what are the barriers between making good decisions. And it's not the decision between right and wrong. It's a decision between right and what is expected, required, and profitable. And this profitable thing is interesting because we don't make extra money for making arrests or doing things. And the way I try and describe it, profitable for cops is the absence of pain. How do we mitigate pain? And I think some of the examples that you provided, Ken, expose us to pain. Like if we have if I actually give feedback to someone and they don't like it, then I'm going to get a complaint because I'm going to be sued. I'm going to get a complaint. And we begin to realize that if we do nothing, we do nothing wrong, which is literally the last place we need our cops to be. Because as Robert described eloquently, over-policing being a real problem, under-policing is a real problem, and finding that sweet spot of where the community desperately needs us to be without doing too much. And I'm not saying that's easy, but it comes to pain. And one of the ways to, I think, assuage pain is safety. And so how does safety in the culture really apply? Because I think cops right now don't know if they feel safe enough to roll down the window and talk to someone that might look different from themselves.
Well, and that's where the policy-driven decision-making is probably going to really take hold at a deeper level, and it's going to be hard to shake that. I mean, there's no question that if you take a values-based approach to leadership, to decision-making, even just in your own choices as an individual, you're opening yourself to be more authentically humble, as Dr. Malecki said. And I think that those are really difficult places to be. And if you don't, for example, trust the community as an officer to treat you fairly, then you're likely to not move toward more values-based. You're more likely perhaps to stick with the policy, because hopefully the policy would have your back. And it's very hard to make those shifts. So I think it's got to be a two-way street of establishing a relationship of trust and legitimacy on both sides to see this begin to shift.
And Michael, I know you talk about it as well, that safety is Simon Sinek talks about it, that the job of leadership in an organization is not to protect the property and the citizenry of the city of Aurora. It's to make those whose job it is to do public safety, to make them feel safe, to have the courage to risk it all. And when policing right now is up here. Like, if we're trying to balance whether this is worth it, we're going to be in a real problem, because the money and the benefits are not worth it. But policing is in the heart. It's much deeper than that, right?
Here's a simple truth from Dr. Stephen Covey. True living is when we are growing continuously from cradle to grave. And that means we're stepping outside of our comfort zones. We're stepping into, we learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because when we're uncomfortable, when we don't understand, when we're curious, when we're impatient, when we're frustrated, those are moments of growth. And so we have to lean into those. However, no human being will get on the skinny branches of life unless they are surrounded by people that they trust. Because why am I going to take the risk if I look around the room and people are going to, take their shots at me, stab me in the back, criticize me? So number one, we have to create environments of high trust, so that in that high trust environment, we're able to get the feedback that Ken talks about, and it comes from a place of well and good intent. And absent that safe place, absent high trust, absent that relationship, then we're going to have climates of fear, which we too often have right now. I was fascinated reading a study recently where they said in a hospital setting, this shocked me, nurses who are in high trust environments make more mistakes than nurses who are in low trust environments. And I thought, wait a minute, how can that be? You would think it's the opposite. But it's really not that they're making more mistakes. It's that they have the confidence to report them, to self-report, because they're not in fear of retribution. They're focused on, let's learn from this mistake. And in the other low trust environments, people are hiding them, and they're pushing them into the shadows, and they're not bringing it in the light. As Simon Sinek says, people become masters of lying, hiding, and faking. And we're in a rules environment versus a value-based environment. People become masters of lying, hiding, and faking. And too often, that's what we've created in our police organizations.
Thank you for that, Michael. Well, I believe we have a poll that we're going to put up now to really talk about, as we bring this first session of webinars to a close, to kind of ask you, where should we be focusing our energy and attention in the near term? So the poll is up on the screen. It's, where are we going next with this energy, and what are we feeling urgent about? So if you folks that are on the line wouldn't mind taking this poll and pick one of those choices, or anything else that comes to mind, you can send that in the text box. But as people are filling that out, Michael, maybe you could tell us about the deliverables of where we're going with this.
Sure. Just take a minute and share what our vision is for this. The very first step in this is wanting to create a webinar series so that we can learn, we can hear your voices, and we can hear your stories, and we can be informed on a deeper level of exploration about what the end of this process needs to look like. We're also going to be sending out the learning notes, as you saw those, leadership lessons, culture lessons. We'll be sending those out to you at the end of every webinar. So not only will you have the benefit, hopefully, of hearing some great dialogue, but you'll also have the benefit of some great notes, so they can hopefully inform your practices in the future. We also ultimately, after all this exploration, we'll never be finished with it, but somewhere when we feel like we know enough, we want to create a blueprint that we can give to the field, city managers, mayors, police chiefs who are thinking about working on their culture, that we'll teach them, what is culture? What are the dynamics of it? What are the areas that you must be paying attention to? So a very simple blueprint that anybody can pick up and literally self-administer. We also are going to create an agency cultural assessment instrument that can be self-administered so that every organization say, look, if we really want to know how's our culture doing right now, or even the climate immediately, they'll be able to take this instrument to inform them. We want to create a facilitation guide that can be handed to police departments that they can effectively use to engage the community in dialogue, and also important to elevate the dialogue between government officials and police dialogue, which right now today are very much in conflict. You look at some of our major cities right now, and it's like there's a war going on between City Hall and our police departments. I don't know how productive that can ever be. We want to create some culture keynotes for agencies and conferences so we can share these learnings that come from all of you with the masses in our profession. We want to develop more strategic partners. So, you know, if you want to join this effort, we certainly welcome you. We hope we can partner with some of the national police organizations, universities. There's many voices who can lend themselves to this project that are going to strengthen us. I mean, as evidenced by this partnership of police practitioners with our cultural anthropologists. You know, who would have ever thought that this marriage could be so fruitful for us in such a quick amount of time. We want to ultimately publish some articles, white papers, and perhaps even, in my highest grand vision, write the book on culture that will serve all of us for many, many years in the future. And then last, we want to develop online and actually live cultural workshops so that we can more inform and educate our profession, City Hall, and society about the real aspects of culture and how it's shaped.
Thank you, Michael. That's terrific. Why don't we show the results, and if that's easy to do, see if what the numbers look like. And it's across. I love that. Policing and community interactions. Love that. I know both Kenneth and Robert, you guys both have been talking very much about that, and
I'm pleased to see that, to be honest. We wanted to do this poll. All of these are really important topics, and it's not that we're not going to pay attention to one or the other, but I think what we get from this that's very helpful for us is a little bit of a sense of where the urgency you feel is, so that we can direct our questions according to some of that that you're feeling. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this to help inform the types of questions that we're going to be posing in the next round of conversations that we have.
So if I could just add one more commentary, we're so appreciative of your comments and your questions, and please bring people with you to these webinars, and let's expand, you know, the influence that these things are having and the voices that we're hearing from in the field. So thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. And as you can see, again, even upping it to an hour didn't feel like enough time to get through everything we had to get through. So we will guarantee you that we will do one of these again with our panelists and give you another opportunity to interact as we kick off our next chapter of our webinar starting next Wednesday, July 8th. Please go to growblueculture.com, www.growblueculture.com. And I think there was a question on if you can get the transcript of this, and the answer is yes, you can get it on that website. Also, if you want it just emailed right to you, please come to us at info@growblueculture.com, and we can get you that information too. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate all your interaction and all your comments. Any questions that we didn't get to, we definitely will send to our panelists, and we'll get those answered for you and get those out to everyone. So again, please register for next week. Join us again. Go to the website for more information, and have a wonderful, wonderful holiday weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks now.